Chris Weafer is CEO of Macro Advisory Limited, a Eurasia-based business consultancy. Great to have you on Global Business Europe. Now, it's a reasonably balanced trade relationship. Talk me through what China and Russia actually trade in.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot more balanced now. If you go back 10 years, it was very heavily biased in Russia's favour because it was selling all sorts of resources to China, but not buying a lot. But over the last 10 years, as Russia's position with the West has deteriorated because of sanctions, then Beijing has insisted that Russia close that trade gap. In other words, that Russia buys a lot more product from China in order to boost Chinese exports. And of course, sanctions have helped that because Russia's had no choice. So today, for example, Russia is the biggest export market for Chinese-made cars or vehicles. And it buys a significant amount of product. If you go to a typical supermarket now in Moscow, for example, in the building that I'm now in, 10 years ago you would have seen, mostly Western-made products, from detergents to all sorts of products. Now you go down and you find that a significant amount of those products have made in China on them. So we've seen this rebalancing. Russia largely has replaced the kind of lost Western-made goods because of sanctions with Chinese-made products, and that's across the board, say cars for sure, but right down to detergents and all sorts of basic goods. It's a more balanced relationship, and that's what we saw this week, I think, with the visit between President Putin and President Xi. It was talking about continuing that balanced relationship. In other words, as China is thinking about buying more energy, you mentioned Power Siberia too, but thinking of buying more energy from Russia, but in exchange it wants a commitment from Moscow that Moscow will buy more products from China to keep the trade in balance.
So this visit really did put a big focus on trade resilience. Where do you think that China and Russia and economic ties have moved forward most noticeably over the last few years, and where do you think they're going to move forward most noticeably in coming years?
Well, as I say, it's been a very broad kind of engagement. Clearly, China has been buying a lot more resources from Russia. So I suppose to the extent from what we hear from Chinese officials is that they see the trade in energy and materials, and that includes coal and timber and all sorts of materials, not just oil and gas, but they see that as helping China to kind of build a resilient supply chain. In other words, a safer supply chain. And I guess that message has been reinforced in the last couple of months with the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. China has been imports a lot of key materials such as gas and oil from around the world by tanker. And it's the problems the Gulf has shown that you can be vulnerable for all sorts of reasons, either by sanctions or deliberate blockades or accidents, etc. So China has been kind of creating a more secure supply line of critical materials from Russia, from Central Asia over the last 10 years. And Russia, in turn, has been broadening out the, if you like, the trade relationship with China. It used to be very heavily dominated with imports from Europe, and now that's completely shifted to China. So it is a much more integrated relationship than has been the case. Russia is no longer just a supplier to Russia, it's a big customer, and vice versa. So it has broadened, it has deepened, it's now a lot more important for both countries.
Chris Weafer at Macro Advisory Limited, thank you very much.